Thank you, Dr. Benson, for that introduction. Just thought I'd mention that Dr. Benson also was in the honors program at Andrews, so it's really cool to meet another Andrews honors scholar. So, yeah, let's just jump right into it. And starting out, I wanted to it was called to my attention that I did not actually tell the story of Antigone in the paper itself. So for those of you who may not know the story of Antigone, it's obviously written by Sophocles, and it was one of his earliest, or one of the earliest known plays by him, written in 441 BC. It's set in the city of Thebes, ancient Greece, and it's shortly after the death of Oedipus in Oedipus and Colonus, the second installment in the Oedipus trilogy. So Oedipus, as you may know, is the Greek mythic figure who kills his father and marries his mother, and this series of events sets off a chain of tragedies, the last of which being the death of Antigone. But after Oedipus discovers the truth about his actions, he leaves the city of Thebes and wanders in the wilderness and eventually dies. But this abdication of the throne leaves a vacuum of power that is swiftly capitalized upon by his two sons, Polynices, his brother Eteocles, who fight and ultimately kill each other. But Creon, his brother-in-law, rises to power in the wake of this battle, siding with the brother Eteocles, and he says that Polynices was a traitor to the state, to the city of Thebes, and that his body is to be desecrated, is to be left for the dogs and beasts to devour. And this decree is one that Antigone, the sister to Polynices and daughter of Oedipus, does not believe that she can honor, because she has a duty to her brother and a duty to her religion, her belief in the will of the gods, to give him a proper burial. So she does this and is ultimately put to death for this crime. So that is the context that we'll be discussing as I read my paper for you all. She did it for love. This, when it comes to the question of Antigone, nobody will dispute. But what type of love, and from whence did that love originate? The standard reading of the story is that Antigone believes what she says when she tells her sister Ismena, "Call it a crime of reverence, but I must be good to those who are below. That's where I will lie. You keep to your choice. Go on insulting what the gods hold dear." For context, this is when she's trying to convince her sister to help her in burying their brother, honoring the gods. Antigone is the face of piety, love for the gods, and sisterly duty, love for one's family. And it's because of these loves that she is sacrificed on the altar of the state. Judith Butler seeks to establish in her work Antigone's claim that this standard reading is completely wrong. Antigone, for Butler, is motivated firstly by incestuous love for her brother, and secondly by a desire for agency stripped of the bonds of both filial and stately allegiance and piety. Certainly it is clear that the sins of incest play a prominent role in the unfolding of Sophocles' tragic play. For is she not the daughter of Oedipus, the most famous incestuous figure of Greek myth? But what, we must ask, is gained or lost by an incestuous reading of Antigone's motivation? To do this, we must first put Butler's reading of Antigone within the context which it requires, namely, Butler's post-structuralist political project of emancipation, inspired in the main by the works of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. Best known for her theory of gender performativity, Butler's career has been centered around the project of freeing the individual from the oppression of sociocultural and linguistic norms. On this view, the standard ways by which we refer to and categorize individuals are reducible to social convention and thus susceptible to what Foucault would call power relations. By freeing the individual from adherence to these tainted norms, we can, according to Butler, attain a higher degree of agency and freedom. Thus, in Antigone's claim, Butler wants to ask the question, what is the method by which we arrive at our sociocultural norms, and is it inherently constrained by an innate ordering of our relationships? The answer to this question, she feels, can also inform our conception of law, which flows out of our normative judgments. In this essay, I will be presenting Butler's case against Hegel's reading of Antigone, as well as her own interpretation of the story. Next, I will explore Hegel's reading of the play, particularly as it pertains to his philosophy of religion. Lastly, in dialogue with German-Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han, I explore how these readings inform the respective conceptions of subjectivity, temporality, and freedom. Central to Butler's critique of Hegel is the way that he handles the question of gender's role in Antigone's motivation. Specifically, he positions Antigone as representative of the feminine aspect of spirit, which prioritizes the family. Arguing against this, Butler points out that Antigone seems to transcend gendered boundaries in play. We are told that Antigone's political act unmans her uncle Creon by putting her in the masculine role, determining the next politically significant event, even in spite of her inability to prevent its ultimate outcome. As Creon himself says in the play, listen, if she's not punished for taking the upper hand, then I am not a man. She would be a man. Antigone's use of political speech, a domain normally relegated to the men of the polis, doubly reinforces her crossing of this gendered boundary. Butler asserts that Hegel seems to shift in the way that he talks about Antigone. He moves from talking about her sacrifice for her brother to talking about the sacrifice that women make by giving up their sons for war in the polis. To the extent, quoting here, that we are now talking of a mother who sacrifices her son for war, we are no longer talking about Antigone, for Antigone is no mother and has no son. Thus, Hegel's text transmutes Antigone in such a way that her criminality loses the force of the alternative legality that it carries, after which she is translated once again into a maternal womankind that she never becomes. She feels, therefore, that Hegel's making of Antigone into a representative of womankind is a bridge too far. On her reading, Antigone is only acting for herself, and her sense of self grounded in her incestuous love. According to Butler, Hegel wants to make her into a martyr for his structuralist notion of womankind, whose only purpose, on her account, is the polity is producing sons who can go off to fight in wars. In this sense, she is arguing that Hegel fetishizes the state by putting service to it as the highest aim and only adjudication of the nobility of Antigone's action. An incestuous Antigone is thus her hero, challenging, like her father Oedipus, not only the accepted normative order of family relations, but also the authority of the state. Butler's basis for within Sophocles' text for establishing Antigone's motivation as incestuous, or at least beyond the scope of kin relations, seems to rest primarily on her reading of a passage where Antigone explains her justification for taking action on behalf of her brother. Here she says, "For never, had children of whom I was the mother, or had my husband perished and been moldering there, would I have taken on myself this task, in defiance of the citizens. In virtue of what law do I say this? If my husband had died, I could have another, and a child by another man, if I had lost the first. But with my mother and father in Hades below, I could never have another brother." Butler takes this passage to be dispositive with regard to Antigone's incestuous motivations. She clearly cannot be motivated simply by love of kin, for she seems to be singling out only one of her kin for this special show of affection. Though she claims to act in the name of the law that from Creon's perspective can appear only as sanction for criminality, her law appears to have but one instance of application. Her brother is, in her view, not reproducible, but this means that the conditions under which the law becomes applicable are not reproducible. This is the law of the instant, and hence a law with no generality and no transposability. Thus, she acts not in the name of the gods of kinship, but by transgressing the very mandates of those gods. While Hegel asserts that the bond between brother and sister is unique in the way that it brings about desireless recognition between the opposing masculine and feminine manifestations of the conscious and unconscious aspects of spirit, Butler believes that their familial ties are really incidental to their true relationship. Nevertheless, she caveats that she does not intend to defend incestuous relationships per se. Rather, she views Antigone's acts as belying a limit, not in the Lacanian sense, but rather one of the range of acts which the law of society will acknowledge and through its power establish as normative. For her, the unconscious takes the form of desires that exist beyond the bounds of the normative structure of society, which challenges and deforms the extant formulations and conceptualizations of power. And here's again Butler. What is this law beyond law, beyond conceptualization, which makes her Antigone act and her defense and speech appear as nothing other than a breaking of law, a law that emerges as the breaking of law? This is a legality of what does not exist and what is unconscious. Not a law of the unconscious, but some form of demand that the unconscious necessarily makes on law, that which marks the limit and condition of the law's generalizability. Here, I believe that Butler is articulating her view that Antigone is calling us towards a positivistic conception of law that is not predicated on any natural or pre-existing order or on familial or gendered relations. For her, this is an essential aspect of crafting a liberal society in which gendered and sexual minorities are afforded equal recognition and protection by the state. She points to the direction of civil rights and LGBT advocacy over the last 50 years or so as evidence that this is an understanding which has been gaining ground in modern society. However, while she is an accomplished scholar of Hegel and commands an impressive verve on the topic of his thought, I believe that in her haste to do away with his structuralist normative frames in his reading of this classic, she has overlooked an important dimension of his interpretation, namely his philosophy of religion and its account of the meaning afforded to us by the ritual of burial. While it has been long acknowledged that religion is an important and prominent aspect of Hegel's philosophical system, modern interpreters have often attempted to sideline this topic as pertains to the development of self-consciousness in his work. This is partly due to the prevalence of Marxist or left Hegelian readings of Hegel, originating with Feuerbach's interpretation and proliferated in the West by members of the Frankfurt School. We take Hegel to be offering a humanist critique of theism, while the right Hegelians, who take Hegel as affording God substantial reality as opposed to mere ideality, have somewhat fallen by the wayside in contemporary philosophy. Recently, however, some attention has been directed towards re-examining the role that Hegel's philosophy of religion plays for this concept of self-consciousness. Paul Wilford has recently argued for the centrality of religion in the development of the concept of self-consciousness within Hegel's system. Quote, the central theme in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is the progressive exploration and development of the necessary conditions for the actualization of the concept of self-consciousness. The heart of such actualization is an intersubjective activity, the reciprocal and equal recognition by independent or self-sufficient agents of one another. The realization of the concept of self-consciousness requires not only a mutual co-determination, however, between a pair of agents, but also that such activity be embedded in a broader social or corporate order that is governed by some acknowledged normative principle. That is, the realization of self-consciousness proves to be possible only within a larger whole that amounts to more than a mere aggregate of interests, because it embodies and exhibits a principle of order. Recognition between agents thus requires participation in a community that is constituted by fundamental spiritual commitments. While the full account of this project of communal recognition is given in the penultimate chapter on religion and phenomenology of spirit, Hegel's philosophy of religion also comes into play during the chapter on spirit, and initially, for our purposes, with respect to the story of Antigone. At the start of the chapter, Hegel introduces the concept of spirit, which he defines as essence that is in and for itself. Essence here referring to the essential nature of consciousness itself, while the phrase in and for itself refers to an object or form of consciousness that both enacts its being and has consciousness of itself at the same time. In the context of a community, it is a principle or law which confers a sense of identity upon the members of said community, while at the same time being constitutive of that community in some meaningful way. At this stage in the phenomenology, our inquiry into the nature of subjectivity has carried us through the successive stages of consciousness, initially with sense certainty and perception, next is self-consciousness, where the master-slave dialectic and the unhappy consciousness unfold. and finally with reason. But it is now at this stage of spirit that we find that consciousness's journey towards knowledge of itself and the world around it arrives at the need to exist in ethical relation to a community of subjects. This gives rise to the need for general normative principles, which are embodied by different forms of law. Hegel here distinguishes two types of law, the human law and the divine. Human law, of course, takes the form of laws of the polity, which are enforced by the state. Hegel identifies this with spirit's conscious aspect, insofar as the laws pertain to the conscious intentions of the people acting in the world of social relations. However, divine law takes on a different form, one which Hegel deems the unconscious aspect of spirit. It must be enacted for reasons that do not pertain directly to the intentions and purposes of people in a civic society, but nevertheless undergirds and informs their conscious actions and experiences. While the state enforces the human law, Hegel sees the family as the locus of authority with respect to the divine law, at least for ancient Greece. As the unaware concept of its consciously aware actuality, as the elemental unit of the actuality of the people, as, to the people, immediate ethical being, as the ethical life, educating, acculturating, and sustaining itself through the work of the universal, work for the universal, as the penates, the household divinities, the family stands over and against the universal spirit. The work that the family performs for the community takes the form of the religious rituals that they enact, which inform the experience and outlook of the members of the polity and motivate them towards ethical action. The family also preserves the identity and individuality of the members of the polis, making them individual people and not just citizens. Crucial to this preservation of identity is the burial ritual. When the family weds their kin to the womb of the earth, the elemental and perishable individuality, they preserve the form of their loved one's individual consciousness, both for themselves and the polity at large. The buried individual's identity takes on a meaning that collapses the civic and private realms. They are remembered both as a citizen and as an individual. While Hegel designates the state and the family as representing the masculine and feminine aspects of spirit, he does not do so as a means of denigrating women or Antigone's role in the story as somehow ultimately subservient to that of the state. For Hegel, Antigone's ethical conscience and duty to her family, which lead her to defy Creon and bury her brother, is itself a manifestation of universal spirit, which is conscious of itself as the fate of essentiality and actuality. Thus, while the feminine embodies spirit's, quote, unconscious aspect, it can nevertheless act on behalf of universal spirit's consciousness of its essential needs, a consciousness which takes the form of the faculty of conscience. While Antigone is ultimately put to death, her action is still relevant to the polity at large. Indeed, we see in the indignant attitude of the people of the city towards Creon's actions an intimation of the fulfillment of what Hegel says in reference to Antigone. The dead individual whose right is infringed knows how to find instruments for his vengeance, which are as actual and forceful as the power that injured him. We can thus take Haman, the son of Creon, at his word when he speaks to Creon of how the people of the city resonate with Antigone's action as just. As he says, "But I'm the one who hears what's said at night, how the entire city is grieving over this girl. No woman has ever had a fate that's so unfair, they say, when what she did deserves honor and fame. She saved her very own brother from being devoured by flesh-eating dogs and pecked apart by vultures as he lay unburied. For this, hasn't she earned glory by his gold?" Now, I think that the story of Antigone can tell us something else with regards to subjectivity, and that is the nature of our relationship with death and what that says about time and our relationship to time. In her essay, Judith Butler also talks about this, titled "Why Read Hegel Now?" Published in the Political Science and Philosophy journal Crisis and Critique, Butler speaks of the potential in Hegel's writing to aid us in answering the question of what time it is, specifically with regards to our place in history. Put simply, in the midst of increasing political and cultural alienation, how can we situate ourselves historically in a way that makes sense to us and squares with our ideas of moral progress? Butler finds the answer to this question in Hegel's ethics, specifically the ethics that arise out of the necessary intersubjective relations of the self and the other in the master-slave dialectic of self-consciousness. While this movement starts out as a fight to the death, it is resolved in a nonviolent need for recognition, when we realize that if we truly destroy the other, we will have in that process lost a part of ourselves. This is indeed an important point to make, as she does, in light of increasing xenophobia and anti-immigrant hostilities in Western society. For Butler, the sense of moral clarity brings about a sense of temporalization, an ability to breathe freely, knowing where we stand with regard to the unfolding of history, provided we do what we can to uphold the recognition we have for one another in liberal society. However, I believe that Hegel can offer us more with regards to the modern crisis of time and subjectivity. Indeed, I believe that the conception of self-consciousness that Butler derives from Hegel is incomplete, and on its own may in fact only contribute to the rise of full phenomenology and attendant sense of detemporalization. In his book, The Scent of Time, German-Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han also addresses the problem of temporality in the modern era. According to Han, with the loss of a common religious myth, signified in Western society by the death of God, the teleology which time had for us previously has fallen apart. Not God, but the free human being is now the master of time. Having been freed of its thrownness, the human being projects what is to come. But this regime change from God to human is not without consequences. It destabilizes time because God is the authority which confers finality and the seal of eternal truth upon the prevailing order. Han here speaks of freedom from thrownness as an allusion to the increasing sense of agency that mankind has, where it takes itself to be master of its own destiny, rather than fulfilling some destiny that was imparted to it from an external source. He goes on to talk about how mythic time has given way to historical time, how eschatology gave way to a generalized sense of progress. But as Butler also alludes to in her essay, even that sense of progress is now in jeopardy. Increasingly, our sense of temporality, of being ensconced on either side by past and future, which have a place in history, is being replaced by a concept which Han refers to as point time. Point time has no duration and is strictly concerned with the present moment. Skip down just to save some time. With point time, the defining feature is information. No longer do we have a sense of knowledge about facts that are situated in a kind of narrative structure. All we have is information. No longer do we have truth, but simply a arrays of discrete facts, which may be recombined at will. Freedom from thrownness is extended to the individual, with the archetype of the self-determining subject who creates his own meaning. Thus arises an atomized individual who inevitably becomes a desiring subject. This change results in a crisis of identity, where desiring subjects are reduced to mere achieving subjects in the capitalist schema. Detemporalization suits this arrangement, where the desiring achieving subjects live only for momentary enjoyment rather than planning for the future or for the community. Han speaks of the proliferation of the vita activa, rather a life centered around production under capitalism. This life allows for no rest, for there is always something more to desire or produce. Its counterpart, the vita contemplativa, which is necessary for the subject's flourishing, is cast aside, as there is simply no time for such things. Paradoxically, this filling of time with activity results in a profound sense of non-time. The like points that whiz around when the narrative string of history loses its tension, atomized subjects are also incapable of sustaining themselves purely on the basis of their own ends and spiral in multivariate directions. But in all of this, one of the most crucial components for the task of restoring our sense of temporality is the notion of death, the point of finality, where all the possibility and infinitude of life collapses on a singularity, and who we are becomes something set, no longer in the process of becoming. Han writes, "Whoever cannot die at the right time must perish in non-time. Dying implies that a life comes to its proper end. It is a life's conclusion. It is here the question of dying at the right time that I think Hegel's interpretation of Antigone is an answer to offer us regarding the problem of atemporality. By giving us a symbolic reason for the act of the burial ritual, Hegel presents us with an important temporalizing tool. That is, he gives us a way to think about death that confers a sense of finality and conclusion, dying at the right time in light of the phenomenology of spirit, how it is possible. I'm just going to skip to the end here. I talk about freedom briefly, but I think that in closing, I think that true freedom is not freedom to exert unlimited agency, rather the freedom to enjoy the fruits of a meaningful life, one which is not a slave to the demands of capitalism and the vita activa, but a freedom that comes with the understanding that there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens.
Thank you, Patrick. Really good of your paper and your presentation. I'm wondering what you might say to those critics of Hegel who tell us that his philosophy of religion isn't really a philosophy of religion at all. That it's ultimately a philosophy of the self, right? Because of course, unlike Kant, he's moving toward absolute idealism. And Hegel understands that philosophy and religion to cover the same question or the same ground, right? Truth. And he says that truth in which God is revealed as part of self-consciousness. So I'm wondering if a critic like Kant or Kierkegaard would say maybe that Hegel's philosophy of religion doesn't do the kind of work that you want it to do in your paper. I'm just curious as to how you might respond to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, this is great. I mean, I think this is you're touching here on the debate that I just briefly glossed over at the beginning of the section on Hegel's chapter on spirit, right? This debate between the left and the right, the aliens, and so yeah, no, I think it's a valid question because absolutely, you know, Hegel's writing after the transcendental turn, where philosophy turns, describing the experience of consciousness from within, and not speaking about metaphysics in an abstract way, and that can be outside of our experience. But I think that, and this is by no means a fleshed out rebuttal, but I think that there are different interpretations of Hegel's philosophy of religion. Specifically, what I'm thinking of is called the qualified revisionist position. And this position basically argues that Hegel adopts a perspectival view of truth, and that God's perspective on truth is one that we have to account for in our epistemology, and that our subjective perspective is only one side of the coin, so to speak. That it's not ultimately reduced to the ideality or the solipsistic subject.
Got it.
But yeah, that's a very big. And thank you for the question.
Very good. Thank you. No, thank you.
We skip my question. It's a tangential. But it seems to me that you mentioned Jung and his critique of Einstein was very much along a lot of these current critiques of modernity in terms of acceleration. The cognitive was, for instance, and how that impacts our perception of time. And what you're saying is that kind of conception of time leads to a very atomized conception of individuality / freedom. I wonder how this critique relates, and I know you're interested in political philosophy. It's all the current critiques of neoliberalism in Patrick Demine and even Michael Sandel. It goes precisely along those lines of very atomized conceptions of the ego of the individual and conceptions of freedom. So how do you connect this to the current critiques of liberalism that we have along these axes?
Yes. Yes. So no, I think that that's a very apt input. Thank you, Dr. Crosby, for the question. I think yeah, no, this is absolutely what, in a way, I see Butler's conception of agency as being in the line of this liberal subject, right? And I think that the kind of conception of the individual that we get in liberal society is one that is very shallow and narrow, and I think that it doesn't provide us with a appropriate framework to derive meaning out of life. It's really structured, and I'm here going to talk about it's a Straussian critique of modern liberalism, but it's made to be low and stable, right? And so it's not there in order to provide us things like meaning in life, things like a sense of temporality, which Butler seems to think that we can get out of that. And I think that's really squarely what I'm trying to critique her for is that we can't turn to liberal democratic notions of the self as being bearers of meaning in that ultimate sense, right? Yeah.
Well, I recognize this is not really the heart of your paper, but it certainly struck me as interesting. The remarks toward the end regarding death and death at the right time. And being that I turned 77 today, I think about death very often. And actually at the center of my own spiritual life is a conviction that death is an enemy, that you cannot die at the right time. There's never a right time for death. And also that death is not an event that is the end point of some sequence that is somehow independent of death, but death is in fact a ongoing feature of our condition in history. And so it seems to me that death is one of those sort of primordial threats to freedom of any kind, because it represents the loss of everything. So, how friendly are you to this notion of dying at the right time?
You're asking a 24-year-old.
It's a good question. So I think that obviously Han is very alliterative and kind of creative with his turns of phrase. So when he says dying at the right time, he's not saying that there's literally a good time and a bad time to die. He's speaking about thinking about death in a context that gives it meaning, and that there is something that there is something in your life that you find grounds your activity. So Heidegger, for example, talks about being towards death, right? And how our realization that we have a limited amount of time in this life, in this earth, that informs our sense of agency and our urgency in what we choose to spend our time with, right? And so I think that's generally where Han is approaching that question from. As far as I'm concerned, I think that thinking about one's death as something that is not simply just a cessation of my own individual experience and my own achievements, but is something that affects the community of people around me, and that is actually a meaningful event for them as well. I think that is something that can help at least frame our way of thinking about death and give it a kind of a meaning in our life that is one we can live with and one we don't just sublimate or put aside or relegate to the unconscious or something like that. But thank you for the question. I think that's a thing to think about. So.
Thank you, and give it up again.